our mandate and to implement our recommendations. Special Rapporteur, Ireland would be interested to hear your views regarding reports of ill treatment in detention, including of children, and the effects on the victims of such treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of Belgium.
10 months have passed since the fraudulent presidential elections in Belarus and the subsequent peaceful protests that called for a change. These were met with brutal repression and the installation of a system of state terror aimed at only one thing: violently silencing the Belarusian people and every possible dissenting voice, in full impunity. Despite the constant calls of the international community, the human rights situation has only continued to worsen. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the ongoing systematic and gross human rights violations, such as the use of arbitrary mass detentions, torture, and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, and punishment against all segments of civil society. Belgium urges Belarus to immediately cease these violations and to immediately and unconditionally release all arbitrarily detained persons. We call on the authorities to fully cooperate with the international initiatives which examine these serious human rights violations, such as the OHCHR-led accountability mechanism and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. We urge the Belarusian authorities to engage in a genuine and inclusive dialogue with civil society that should lead to new elections under international scrutiny, to reforms, to democracy, and to respect for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
I'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her report on the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus and pay tribute to the courage shown by the Belarusian people. The report's concerns about arbitrary arrests and detentions have been brought into sharp relief by the Belarusian authorities' outrageous forced landing of a civilian airliner and arrest of journalist Roman Protasevich, who has since been forced to appear twice in staged public events. These actions directly violate human rights. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of Mr. Protasevich and all those others held on political grounds. Moreover, the reported closure of the OHCHR office in Minsk represents a grave step backwards in engagement with the international community. Lukashenko must cease his brutal campaign of repression, release all political detainees, and engage in dialogue with civil society and opposition figures to seek a peaceful solution to the ongoing political crisis. For our part, we have increased support to civil society and independent media, and we will support international mechanisms to investigate human rights violations, and we will implement sanctions against those responsible for such violations. Madam President, I'd like to ask the Special Rapporteur to elaborate on her assistance to the High Commissioner in her evidence-gathering mission.
Thank you. We'll have a video statement from the representative of Iceland.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her report, and we welcome the readiness of Ms. Marin to assist the High Commissioner in her evidence-gathering and advocacy mission. We are deeply concerned with the deteriorating situation of human rights in Belarus since the presidential elections last year. The findings of the Special Rapporteur are highly alarming, in particular massive violations, tightening of regulations for civil society organizations operating in Belarus, tightening of regulations pertaining to the freedom of peaceful assembly, as well as legislative developments that could further restrict freedom of opinion and expression. In this regard, we regret that the government of Belarus has consistently failed to recognize the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, and we urge the government to engage constructively with Ms. Marin and her mandate. While we welcome that the government of Belarus has issued standing invitations to some thematic special procedures to visit Belarus, we appeal to the government to allow the Special Rapporteur to visit the country in her official capacity. In conclusion, we would like to ask Ms. Marin how the government of Belarus could better ensure civil and political rights in education. I thank you.
Thank you. We'll have a video statement from the representative of Poland.
Madam Special Rapporteur, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. We wish to thank for your comprehensive and valuable report on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We fully support its conclusions, urging Belarus to engage in cooperation with your mandate. Poland deplores the critically deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus. Yet another time, we reiterate our calls on Belarus to stop violations and abuses of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the country, and to ensure that all involved in those violations are brought to justice. We strongly urge Belarusian authorities to immediately release all political prisoners, whose number continues to grow from one month to another, counting already more than 500 persons. Among them, there are leaders of the Union of Poles in Belarus, Angelika Borys and Andrzej Poczobut, independent journalists and media workers, including blogger Roman Protasevich, journalists of TV Belsat, Katarina Andreeva and Daria Chultsova, and many others. Madam Special Rapporteur, you expressed concerns in your report about the inclusivity in the education system by ethno-linguistic minorities, among other groups. How the situation of human rights of members of national minorities in the country can be improved? Furthermore, what actions would you recommend to the international community to amplify the impact of your report's conclusions and recommendations? I thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Chair. Bulgaria allies itself with the statement by the European Union. We note with regret the observation in the reports that the situation in Belarus continues to worsen in a climate of fear, impunity, and lack of accountability for perpetrators. Bulgaria shares the concern of the Special Rapporteur about the tightening of legal provisions pertaining to the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of association, and operation of civil society organizations in Belarus. Such legislative changes have practically left no space for any legal democratic activities of the society, while legally justifying the massive abuses and human rights violations. Bulgaria condemned as absolutely unacceptable and extremely alarming the forceful diversion and landing in Minsk on the 23rd of May of Ryanair's civilian flight from Athens to Vilnius. The Bulgarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs qualified the act as a very serious violation of international norms. We were dismayed by the unlawful detention, inhuman treatment, and forced confessions of social media activists and human rights defender Roman Protasevich. Bulgaria calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners and unjustly detained persons, including Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega. Bulgaria underlines the need for an end of all violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Belarus. We extend our support to the international initiatives that seek to address the impunity for those serious violations. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the representative of the Ukraine via Zoom.
Madam Vice President, we welcome the Special Rapporteur and appreciate her report. Ukraine regrets that the human rights situation in the neighboring Belarus remains extremely worrying. We are alarmed by the continuing reports of torture and other inhumane or degrading treatment, persecution of journalists, opposition leaders, and human rights defenders. We equally deplore the fact that these and other wrongdoings against the people of Belarus are multiplied by demonstrative impunity for their perpetrators. The recent case of forced landing of Ryanair flight, which put in danger the lives of innocent civilians, is exceptionally appalling. Ukraine resolutely calls on Belarus authorities to finally hear the voice of the people, ensure justice and effective remedy for the victims, and release all those illegally detained. We also strongly urge the official Minsk to return to compliance with its human rights obligations and engage constructively with the Special Rapporteur and the OHCHR. While standing ready to back any meaningful effort aimed at assisting Belarus in resolution of its current challenges, Ukraine once again warns the Russian Federation against interfering in internal affairs of its neighbors. We support the democratic aspirations of the people of Belarus and reiterate our commitment to good neighborly relations with them based on respect to the rule of law and human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of Albania.
Madame la Présidente, l'Albanie. Albania welcomes the Special Rapporteur and we thank her for her report. We remain concerned at the human rights situation in Belarus, despite the appeals of the international community for a dialogue between all political stakeholders. The human rights situation has hardly improved. Restrictions on fundamental freedom continue. We strongly condemn these violations. We condemn the forcing down of a civil aircraft in Minsk on the 23rd of May, a violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, followed by the arrest of journalist Roman Protasevich and his partner by the Belarus authorities. We call upon Belarus to immediately release them without condition and to release all people unfairly detained, including political prisoners. The report highlights a growing wave of repression and massive human rights violations in the country and requires that the government introduce specific lasting change. We share these conclusions and regret the lack of cooperation on the part of the government with the Special Rapporteur. We will support the Belarus people and civil society which speaks out despite oppression and call for a guarantee that those responsible for human rights violations in Belarus shall not go unpunished. Finally, we reiterate our view on the need to establish a dialogue amongst all stakeholders in order to open the road to social peace in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of the Netherlands.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. Thank you, Special Rapporteur Marin, for your comprehensive and deeply concerning report on the human rights situation in Belarus. In recent weeks, the deplorable repression tactics the authorities employ to suppress opposition and free speech caused renewed shock and outrage. The increase in arbitrary detentions and continued reports of ill treatment and torture of detained persons are unacceptable. It is extremely concerning and in direct defiance of both the letter and the spirit of the ICCPR that legislative changes have in practice institutionalized intimidation through the use of administrative resources and judicial harassment. All the while security services are placed above the law. These grave violations of human rights cannot go unanswered for. The Netherlands is proud to support the International Accountability Platform for Belarus, set up to collect, consolidate, verify and preserve evidence of grave human rights violations in the country. We encourage further efforts to promote accountability and support the request of the High Commissioner to contribute to justice for victims of human rights violations in Belarus. We call on the Belarusian authorities to immediately hold all repression against opposition members, activists, members of CSOs and independent journalists and to unconditionally release all political prisoners. Dear Ms. Marin, what are the options to further strengthen your cooperation with the office to advance accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the representative of the Republic of Moldova via video statement.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, we would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the update on the human rights situation in Belarus. Republic of Moldova has been following closely and with concern the developments in the country. In this situation, respect for human rights, in particular with regard to the absolute prohibition of torture and ill treatment, must be at the center of our considerations. We believe that the Belarusian people will manage to restore an environment of credibility and trust while overcoming these difficult times in a peaceful manner and in the framework of an authentic and inclusive dialogue for the benefit of the society as a whole. Republic of Moldova values its partnership with the Republic of Belarus and will continue to express its full support towards strengthening of democracy, prosperity and stability. During this challenging time, we would like to reiterate our solidarity with the people of Belarus and our support for a peaceful and democratic solution for this crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a video statement from the representative of New Zealand.
President, New Zealand welcomes the Special Rapporteur's update on the human rights situation in Belarus. New Zealand is deeply concerned at the unprecedented deterioration in human rights in Belarus. The ongoing forcible and violent repression of opposition and dissent in Belarus is unacceptable. For this reason, New Zealand joined others in announcing targeted measures against key figures in the Belarusian government and security forces. The rights to freedom of expression and peaceful demonstration are fundamental and inalienable. New Zealand urges the Belarusian government to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained for peacefully expressing their views or gathering in protest, and to conduct independent, impartial and transparent investigations into all allegations of human rights violations, especially torture or ill treatment. We encourage the government of Belarus to engage with the Special Rapporteur and to implement the recommendations in her report. Finally, New Zealand calls on the government of Belarus to heed the repeated calls for it to abolish the death penalty. Thank you.
My apologies. Thank you. We'll now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to the Right Livelihood Award Foundation.
Madam President, Human Rights Center Viasna and Right Livelihood welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur, which is yet another account of the increasing human rights violations committed by Belarus in recent months, seeing a record number of arbitrary arrests and criminal persecutions of peaceful protesters. As of June 30, Belarus counted 526 political prisoners, a number which continues to increase. We are alarmed by the latest legislative developments, in particular the proposed amendments to the law on countering extremism, which would be a new tool for the persecution of civil society and could lead to the forced closure of human rights organizations. Several NGOs, including Human Rights Center Viasna, are already under criminal investigation. We remain particularly concerned about the situation of Marfa Rabkova, Andrei Chapyuk, Tatiana Lasitsa, and Leonid Sudalenka, who have now been in pre-trial detention for months. The hijack of Ryanair Flight 4978 to arrest journalist Roman Protasevich shows the length to which the authorities are ready to go in order to suppress civil society. We call upon the Council to renew the mandate of Special Rapporteur and to ensure continuous scrutiny on Belarus. We urge the authorities to implement all the recommendations of the report and initiate a serious and credible process for constitutional reform, as well as immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights.
Спасибо. Мы подчеркиваем глубокий кризис.
The crisis with human rights and the stepping up of needs. There are more than 600 people in detention. Many criminal cases have been brought against activists. The law has been turned into an instrument for political repression. The legal process is just formal, and there's no reaction on the part of the public. The latest situation, the work of lawyers is extremely important. They are being politically persecuted for their activities and for expressing their views. All of these people and others have for months now been in detention. No less than 20 lawyers have been disbarred, including Maxim Konon, Konstantin Michel, Alexander Plichenko. Andrei Machalov was notified of disbarment in the middle of a case. Lawyer Maxim Znak has been detained for 10 months now, while his lawyer has been facing continued pressure and punishment. The recent faculty graduate Vinikava was arrested soon after giving a speech in support of repressed lawyers. The recent amendments to the laws have stripped the community of lawyers of independence. The situation requires an immediate reaction from the international community.
Thank you. We'll hear from Lawyers for Lawyers.
Madam President, Lawyers for Lawyers and Lawyers Right Canada thank the Special Rapporteur for her report. We share the Special Rapporteur's concerns that the already existing pressure and harassment of lawyers in Belarus intensified in 2020 and persists in 2021. We are alarmed by reports that in the aftermath of the August 2020 presidential elections, many lawyers have been arrested or detained for exercising their professional activities. There are disturbing reports that many arrested and detained citizens have not had access to a legal representative of their own choosing, and that lawyer-client confidentiality has often not been respected. In recent months, there has been an unprecedented increase in the disbarment of lawyers by the Qualification Commission for Legal Practice in the Republic of Belarus. Many of those lawyers were defending opposition figures, and protesters were speaking out about the rule of law, administration of justice, and human rights. The Belarus government has also introduced amendments to the law on the bar and advocacy in Belarus that restrict independence of the legal profession as a whole. We asked the Council to urge Belarus to guarantee that all lawyers in Belarus are able to practice their profession without intimidation, harassment, improper interference, or reprisals, and repeal the amendments to the law on the bar and advocacy in Belarus, and amend the law to ensure independence of the legal profession according to international standards. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Human Rights House Foundation.
Human Rights House Foundation and Belarusian Human Rights House joined 34 other organizations in recommending the renewal of the Special Rapporteur's mandate with sufficient resourcing and funding. As Belarus's human rights crisis deepens, the Special Rapporteur's mandate is more important than ever. The Special Rapporteur remains an accessible and safe channel for Belarusian civil society to deliver up-to-date information from within the country. However, such updates are becoming increasingly difficult to deliver. The recent changes to the criminal code are of real concern. These legislative changes went into effect in June and further limit a range of human rights and target the political opposition, independent media, and dissenting opinion. We are gravely concerned for journalist and media manager Andrei Alexandrov, who has been charged with treason under the criminal code and faces up to 15 years in prison for doing his legitimate human rights work. We call for his immediate release and exoneration. Madam President, the Special Rapporteur reflects in her report that even the most basic social services are under threat in Belarus at the moment, like access to education. We ask the Special Rapporteur whether she is aware of children being used as a tool for reprisals against human rights defenders, as in the case of the family of Vladimir Yavorsky, and what is her assessment of the impact on the children of human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from World Organization Against Torture.
Vyazna and International Committee on Investigation of Torture in Belarus would like to thank Madam Special Rapporteur for her report and important work. The human rights crisis in Belarus is still ongoing, and torture, arbitrary arrests, and unfair trials continue to be an everyday reality for many Belarusians. Our partners have documented more than 2,500 torture cases since August 2020. The sudden and unexplainable death of political prisoner and activist Witold Ashurak in a prison last month, and the desperate suicide attempt in a courtroom of another political prisoner, Stefan Latipov, after he spent 51 days in a pressure chamber, are only the latest confirmation of how endemic torture is in Belarus. To this day, not a single case of torture has been investigated. Recent legislative changes have further institutionalized impunity, in particular amendments to the Criminal Procedure Code removing time limit for police to respond to complaints, and a new law on national security which further limits liability of law enforcement officials. We call on the Human Rights Council to keep closely monitoring the human rights situation in Belarus and to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, ensuring that she has sufficient resources to carry out her work. We also urge the government to provide immediate and unimpeded access to the country to the Special Rapporteur and to fully cooperate with the newly established fact-finding mission.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and the International Commission of Jurists remain concerned at the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus and the ongoing systematic attacks on the independence of the legal profession and at the judiciary's lack of independence. The judiciary continues to be instrumentalized and to enforce legislation arbitrarily to intimidate, harass and punish dissenting voices. As the report highlights, in politically motivated cases, judges are allegedly expected to follow the prosecutor's demand, resulting in violations of defendants' fair trial rights, including access to a lawyer. We reiterate that the independence of the judiciary is a key pillar of the rule of law and a prerequisite for the human rights protection. We condemn the persistent attacks of lawyers, including increased cases of prosecution solely for performing their professional duties. years. At least 70 lawyers have been disbarred since the disputed outcome of August 2020 elections. The Ministry of Justice tightly controls the functioning of bar associations, and recent amendments to the law on the bar and advocate activity further increase control, prohibiting individual lawyers and private legal firms from representing people charged with certain criminal and administrative offences. We urge Belarus to ensure the independence of the judiciary and the legal profession and immediately cease all form of harassment, intimidation and popular interference. We call on the Special Rapporteur and on this Council to keep closely monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Article 19 International Center Against Censorship.
Report of the Special Rapporteur, which details the drastic deterioration in the right to freedom of expression in Belarus. The repression of independent voices in Belarus has been relentless since elections in August 2020. In the aftermath of the outrageous arrest of Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapiga, we are deeply concerned over their treatment in detention, where the alleged use of torture by Belarusian security forces has been widely documented. Their families are deprived of information about conditions of their detention, including from lawyers who face persecution if they become too vocal about their work. The constant uncertainty and lack of access for those detained has become the reality of the families of not just Roman and Sofia, but also for the over 500 political prisoners currently behind bars in Belarus. The regime has begun to impose tougher charges on those in pre-trial detention to further suppress dissent. Andrei Alexandrov, a journalist who has been behind bars since January, has recently seen his charges related to public order escalate to more severe charges of high treason under Article 356 of the Belarusian Criminal Code. Andrei now faces a sentence of between 7 and 15 years in prison. We urge this Council to make explicit calls for the immediate and unconditional release of Roman Protasevich, Sofia Sapiga, Andrei Alexandrov, and the over 500 political prisoners currently behind bars in Belarus simply for expressing their right to freedom of expression, including in Council resolutions on Belarus. It is essential this Council maintains its efforts to collect and preserve evidence of these crimes under international law, with the ultimate aim of holding perpetrators accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Ladies and gentlemen, the human rights situation in Belarus continues to plummet. Since August 2020, more than 30,000 people have been detained for participating in peaceful assemblies and expressing their opinions. Over 500 political prisoners are in jail on criminal charges. Politically motivated trials are held with despicable violations of the principles of fair trial. The government continues to attack NGOs, human rights defenders, and journalists. 6 of my fellow human rights defenders are currently in prison. Either 25 journalists, including 15 employees of Tut.by, the most popular internet portal in the country. We continue to register facts of torture and other ill treatment. Human Rights Center Vesna alone has interviewed more than 2,000 victims of torture. The authorities failed to investigate any of these cases. We are particularly concerned about the stifling changes in the legislation that criminalize any public criticism of the regime. Belarus does not comply with its international obligations. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur will monitor the developments. Belarus drama is not its internal affair anymore. It should become the concern of whole international community.
Thank you. We'll hear from the Advocates for Human Rights.
Madam President, the Advocates for Human Rights thanks the Special Rapporteur on Belarus for her report. We especially welcome her focus on the post-election violence, detention conditions, and reprisals against human rights defenders and civil society. The Advocates for Human Rights shares these concerns. Police used excessive force against peaceful protesters, causing bruises, broken bones, and other physical injuries. Thousands were arbitrarily detained. Prison officials crowded detainees into small cells, even forcing 120 people into one. Women experienced both sexual violence and threats of rape while in detention. Those who reported these violations were threatened with harm to their children and with prosecution themselves if they did not drop their complaints. The government has harassed and intimidated human rights defenders and civil society in the election's aftermath, accusing some individuals and NGOs of violating the criminal code by financing mass protests as pretense to arrest and detain them. Several activists have fled the country for their safety. Others have been arbitrarily arrested and detained. We reiterate the Special Rapporteur's call for the government to release immediately and rehabilitate all those arbitrarily detained, and the prosecution of human rights defenders, conduct investigations into human rights violations surrounding the protest, and bring perpetrators of these violations to justice. Thank you.
We'll now hear from the International Commission of Jurists.
Madam President, the ICJ is concerned at the continuing widespread and systematic human rights violations committed in Belarus since the 2020 presidential election. In particular, the unnecessary disproportionate use of force by security forces against peaceful protesters, the arbitrary arrest and detention of thousands of people, and denial of access to a lawyer, systematic torture and ill treatment following arrest and during detention, and forced disappearances, the unwarranted control by the executive over the judiciary, the lack of independence of the legal profession, and the targeting of lawyers for their human rights work through disbarment, criminal and administrative proceedings. The arbitrary detention of Roma Protasevich and Sofia Sapega after the plane on which they were traveling had to carry out a forced landing in Minsk as a result of forced terrorism alert. Belarus has systematically failed to engage with international procedures, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Belarus and the Moscow mechanism. Therefore, the ICJ urges Belarus to immediately release all individuals arbitrarily detained, drop any charges which they may face as a result of the exercise of their human rights, and provide access to effective remedies for human rights violations. Undertake impartial, independent, effective, and prompt investigations into allegations of human rights violations and hold those responsible to account. Fully engage with international mechanisms, in particular those established specifically in Belarus. I thank you.
This was the last speaker on the list, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Anaïs Marin for her concluding remarks. Madam, you have 12 minutes and 40 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vice President. This is extremely short, of course. I thank you for your interest in my report and your support to my mandate. There were 35 statements made today. I think it shows the interest that the international community pays to the situation of human rights in Belarus. I cannot answer all the questions that were asked, of course. Let me first switch back to French to address the questions that were posed in French.
I would stress the need for the international community to particularly support human rights defenders, lawyers and journalists who are subject to continuous harassment and persecution, and in particular to avoid that no more wrong is done to them. The risk of reprisals against people in the eye of the international community, of the UN and my mandate, is unfortunately a very high risk, and that's why I'm extremely watchful about protecting my sources. I would encourage all people in civil society and victims to be extremely careful. Security in communication is something which needs to be the watchword of all of those who don't want additional wrong to be done, additional harm to be done to victims or their next of kin, or to the two professional communities which are most at risk, human rights defenders and journalists. This is particularly important because you can't rule out the possibility that repression will worsen or that their means of communicating with the outside world are even more reduced than they are now. In response to the question from Switzerland about the shutting down of the High Commissioner's office in Minsk, it's very unfortunate that they had to shut because the country is depriving itself of a means of communication and cooperation, which has shown how useful it can be in promoting human rights in practice. I think that this development makes it all the more necessary to have my mandate recognized by the authorities in Belarus, because the international isolation of the country is not a solution.
To address a number of issues, I tried to group them. Regarding children, I would like to thank the EU and the Human Rights House Foundation for raising attention again on this issue, which, as you know, has been central to my mandate since I was appointed almost 3 years ago. I am well aware of cases of intimidation of human rights defenders, social and political activists, by way of using threats to remove children from what the authorities label as dysfunctional families. This amounts to using children to blackmail parents in order to force the latter to self-censorship or to leave the country into exile. I received evidence about dozens of such cases. This is usually done by using Decree number 18 that envisages state custody for children of families in so-called socially dangerous situations. A measure which is initially meant to extract children from an environment that is dangerous for their well-being in case of domestic violence, substance abuse, or criminal activities of parents. However, as a result of abusive administrative regulations, parents who have been detained during peaceful protests or as a result of raids on their offices, for example, for those who work as journalists or human rights defenders, these people have seen their underage children being taken away to foster care, although alternative custody among relatives would have been less traumatizing for them. The problem is also that it can take up to 6 months of legal and bureaucratic battle to return the child to his family. In my next thematic report to the General Assembly, which will be finalized soon, I pay special attention to such cases and incidents which target particularly harshly and maybe purposefully single mothers. Regarding the question of how the international community can help civil society, the whole Belarusian society remains in collective post-traumatic shock. I encourage everyone who cares to offer humanitarian help in the form of psychological support, consultations for free in Russian with experienced psychologists, rehabilitation stays abroad for children and adults alike, fellowships abroad for students. Bearing in mind the prevention dimension of my mandate, I also allow myself to recommend that neighboring countries in particular prepare for a possible influx of people seeking shelter abroad from Belarus. In fact, thousands of families have already fled Belarus in recent months. Yet they do not necessarily apply for refugee status, meaning that they do not enjoy the legal protection normally granted to asylum seekers. This is a contingency that countries ready to welcome persecuted Belarusians must adapt to and prepare for, because under the current trends, it is unlikely that the flows will diminish. These people will need support to find jobs, housing, and to access education and health services abroad. I would like to emphasize that all human rights are interconnected. Violation of civil and political or other rights will inevitably lead to human rights constraints in other areas, such as the right to education, and this is what happened in Belarus. This already implies that in order to ensure the protection of rights to education, the government should uphold and fully respect the right to freedom of opinion and expression, freedoms of speech and association, cultural and academic freedoms. Answering the questions asked by the Czech Republic and the United States regarding accountability for the most serious crimes. As most delegations have rightly underlined, it is essential to hold perpetrators of the most serious crimes committed over the past year accountable. Impunity, as it is the case now in Belarus, will bring reoccurrence. If we want these serious human rights abuse to stop, the perpetrators must understand that they cannot escape liability forever. Let me remind that the prohibition of torture, for example, has attained the status of a peremptory norm of general international law, jus cogens, which means that anyone has the moral obligation, erga omnes, to take action against those who perpetrate torture. I have heard that prosecutors in criminal courts of countries which recognize universal jurisdiction for such serious crimes have already taken up the responsibility of investigating allegations of torture submitted by victims who have found refuge in these countries. This is a first step to fight impunity. However, for perpetrators to be held accountable, the decisions of these courts would have to be enforceable in Belarus, which is not currently possible, unfortunately. I encourage all those who care to contribute to the implementation of Human Rights Council Resolution 46/20, which established an examination team with a view to, I quote, contributing to accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims, and where possible, to identify those responsible, unquote. Which leads me to addressing the question asked by a number of countries, notably the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK, regarding coordination between my mandate and that of the High Commissioner. Since the day I have assumed the mandate entrusted to me, I have been working closely with the OHCHR, as well as with other UN human rights mechanisms. This includes virtually daily exchange information, meetings and brainstorming on action that can be taken jointly, including, of course, with thematic special procedures mandate holders, whom I thank for their support. The Council's Resolution 46/20 opens new opportunities for cooperation. I already had several meetings here in Geneva last week, including with the High Commissioner and her team working on examination on Belarus, as well as with the 3 high-level experts appointed by her in May. As the OHCHR's core team working on the implementation of this resolution is due to become fully operational in coming weeks, I'm happy to let you know that we started designing a modus operandi to work collaboratively, including with other relevant mandate holders. This morning I had a phone call with the Special Rapporteur on torture, and last week I met with the Special Rapporteur on extrajudiciary executions. Over the past year, I have been cooperating very closely with other relevant mandate holders, such as the Working Groups on Enforced Disappearances, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, as well as Special Rapporteurs on freedom of expression, on freedom of peaceful assembly, on human rights defenders, and on the independence of judges and lawyers. I see my role primarily in providing country expertise on Belarus to the OHCHR core team, to provide also advice and guidance upon request. Also, let me stress that I have received a considerable amount of first-hand information and testimonies directly from victims of human rights violations or their relatives over the past year. That includes video recordings, photos, medical records, court hearing protocols. I am readily forwarding this data to the Secretariat of the examination team so that they can proceed with verification, cross-checking, and plan interviews with victims wherever they might be. My mandate will cooperate with the examination team and assist in the implementation of Resolution 46/20. I encourage the international community to continue its support to the 2 mandates while reiterating calls to the government of Belarus to cooperate with both. Lastly, what can you do? Что делать? I would have 2 comments here. What can the international community do to promote human rights in Belarus? The primary responsibility to respect human rights rests with the authorities of the concerned country. In circumstances whereby these authorities are neglecting their obligations and commitments under the international human rights law, I see no other way than to continue pressuring the government to compel it to show respect for human rights. Unfortunately, in the case of Belarus today, with its systemic institutional deficiencies, whereby the whole system of governance is geared towards restraining rather than protecting and promoting human rights, there is a long way to go. Thus, the international community should work collectively and in synergy between countries and international and regional organizations, human rights groups, and social activists to make the authorities respect human rights. In terms of concrete recommendations, I would suggest that member states follow up on the recommendations that they submitted to Belarus in the course of the 3rd cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. For example, they could encourage the government to adopt a new action plan on human rights and help the relevant bodies to take steps and implement measures that will allow to achieve real progress, notably in the course of the announced reform of the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank Ms. Anaïs Marin for her participation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we invite our next speaker to the podium, we will just take a short break and then we will resume.